What happens when Big Shaq walks into an exclusive barbershop and is told they're fully booked, while empty chairs sit in plain sight? But what happens next? No one in that shop could have predicted. A bold stand, an unexpected twist, and a lesson in respect they'll never forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The morning sun gleamed off the glass windows of towering buildings, casting long shadows on the bustling streets. Big Shaq adjusted the hood of his sweatshirt, a comfortable fit draped over his broad frame, and stepped out of his sleek black SUV. The city air carried the faint aroma of fresh coffee, street food, and the undeniable hum of life moving fast. He had woken up feeling good, the kind of day where everything seemed to flow effortlessly. A rare day off, no meetings, no commitments, just time for himself. And what better way to start than with a fresh haircut? He always believed a good cut could change a man's mood. Looking sharp wasn't just about vanity. It was about feeling put together, confident, ready for anything. As he strolled down the sidewalk, people turned to look, some whispering excitedly, others nodding in respect. Shaq was used to it, but he never let it change him. He wasn't just a basketball legend or a millionaire. He was still that kid from Newark, still grounded, still Shaquille. He waved at a little boy wearing a Lakers jersey, signed a napkin for an old lady who recognized him from TV, and laughed with a street vendor who joked about how his shoes were big enough to be boats. A few blocks down, his eyes caught something, a high-end barbershop he had never noticed before. The place had an expensive aura, the kind where men in tailored suits walked out looking like they had stepped straight out of a magazine. The golden letters on the glass read, Vincent's Grooming Lounge. The deep mahogany interior, the soft jazz playing inside, the scent of rich sandalwood. It all gave the impression of exclusivity. Shaq grinned to himself. Why not? He had been to hundreds of barbershops, from small back-alley spots where clippers buzzed over hip-hop beats to celebrity studios where appointments were booked months in advance. But something about this place intrigued him. He pulled open the glass door and stepped inside. The moment he did, the air in the room changed. At first, it was subtle. The low murmur of conversation softened, just slightly. The receptionist, a young man in a crisp white shirt, gave a polite but measured smile. The barbers, mid-cut, stole quick glances through the mirror. It wasn't obvious. No one gasped. No one outright refused him, but Shaq felt it. A shift, a pause, something unspoken. Still, he kept his energy light. He approached the counter, resting his massive hands on the polished wood. "Hey, brother," he said, voice warm. "Y'all got room for a walk-in?" The receptionist hesitated. It was a half-second delay, but Shaq noticed. The young man glanced toward the barbers, searching for guidance before finally responding. We're actually fully booked today, sir," he said, his tone polite but firm. Shaq raised an eyebrow, glancing at the empty chairs. He wasn't the type to pull the "do you know who I am" card, but he had been around long enough to recognize when something wasn't adding up. He leaned back slightly, giving the shop another once-over. There were 5 barber stations. Only 3 were occupied. "Fully booked, huh?" he said casually. "You sure about that?" The receptionist nodded quickly. "Yeah, appointments only." Just then, the small bell above the door chimed, and a middle-aged man in a designer suit walked in. He barely made it 3 steps before one of the barbers, an older gentleman with silver-rimmed glasses, smiled and gestured him over. "Mr. Calloway, right on time. Take a seat." Shaq watched as the man sat down, exchanging pleasantries with the barber. No mention of an appointment. No hesitation. Something in Shaq's chest tightened. Not anger, not yet. More like recognition. This wasn't new. He had seen it before, felt it before. It was the way some people hesitated before shaking his hand, the way store clerks watched him a little too closely, the way doors that should have been open sometimes remained closed. He exhaled slowly, keeping his face neutral. "Right," he said, nodding. "Got it." The receptionist glanced away, pretending to adjust the schedule book. Shaq could have left then, could have walked out, shrugged it off, gone to one of the dozens of other barbershops in the city that would have welcomed him with open arms. but something kept him rooted to the spot. Was it stubbornness? Maybe. But more than that, it was the principle. He had been denied something today, not because they were booked, but because of who they assumed he was. And that didn't sit right. The shop had grown eerily quiet. The other clients had noticed the tension, though none of them spoke up. The barbers were avoiding eye contact, focusing on their work, pretending as if the 7-foot man standing in the middle of the room wasn't exposing something uncomfortable. Shaq's gaze landed on one of the younger barbers, maybe in his mid-20s, lingering by the back station. The kid looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Shaq saw it. Hesitation, guilt, maybe even shame. The kid looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he turned away, pretending to clean his station. Shaq exhaled through his nose. He didn't need to stay here any longer. He took a slow step back, then another. The receptionist, still avoiding his gaze, murmured something about, "Sorry for the inconvenience." Shaq said nothing. As he turned toward the door, something unexpected happened. One of the older clients, an older black man, maybe in his 60s, dressed sharp in a tailored jacket, spoke up. "Shaq," he said, voice steady but knowing. "You don't need this place." Shaq stopped, glancing back. The man's eyes were kind but firm, like he had seen this exact scene play out too many times before. "Ain't nothing here for you, brother," he said. "Go where you're wanted." Shaq held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Without another word, he pulled open the door and stepped back out onto the street. The city was still buzzing, people walking past, cars honking in the distance. Life moved on. He ran a hand over his head, feeling the stubble. He still needed a haircut. And now he was going to find a place where he was welcomed, where respect wasn't a privilege, it was the standard. And something told him this wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The moment Shaq stepped through the door, he felt it. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle shift in the air, the way conversations dipped into hushed tones, the way movement inside the shop slowed just slightly. He had walked into enough places in his lifetime to recognize the feeling immediately. The barbershop was pristine, the kind of place designed to impress. Dark oak floors gleamed under the overhead lighting, and the scent of aftershave and expensive cologne lingered in the air. The waiting area had deep leather chairs, and the barbers, dressed in pressed black vests over crisp white shirts, moved with precision. But right now, they weren't moving much at all. Shaq stepped forward, his sneakers making almost no sound against the polished floor. He approached the sleek marble-topped counter where the receptionist stood, a slim young man with neatly combed hair and an expensive-looking watch. The receptionist gave him a tight-lipped smile. Not warm, not rude, just hesitant. "Hey, brother," Shaq said, his deep voice smooth but friendly. "Y'all got room for a walk-in?" The receptionist's eyes flicked behind Shaq, as if looking for someone to step in. Then he straightened his posture and gave a rehearsed nod. Unfortunately, we're fully booked today," he said. Shaq's gaze slid past the counter, taking in the shop. 3 barbers were cutting hair, but 2 chairs remained empty. Another barber leaned against his station, scrolling on his phone, looking like he had been doing nothing for a while. "Fully booked?" Shaq repeated slowly, his brows raising. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded again. "Yeah, appointments only." Shaq glanced at the empty chairs once more, then back at the receptionist. He had been in this situation before, too many times to count. The words changed, the settings changed, but the feeling, that never did. He didn't say anything for a moment, just let the silence sit there. The receptionist swallowed, shifting his weight slightly. Shaq exhaled through his nose and nodded. Got it. The tension in the shop should have eased now that he had seemingly accepted their excuse, but instead, it felt like the air got even heavier. The barbers were working, but their movements were slower, more deliberate, as if trying not to call attention to themselves. Then, just as Shaq turned slightly, the door behind him opened, and the small bell above it chimed. A man stepped in. Middle-aged, maybe in his early 50s, dressed in a tailored navy suit with polished leather shoes. He carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone who had never had to question whether he belonged anywhere. The man barely made it 2 steps inside before one of the barbers, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, straightened up and greeted him. "Mr. Calloway, right on time. Come on in." Shaq watched as the man nodded in acknowledgement and walked straight to the chair, shaking hands with the barber like they were old friends. No appointment mentioned, no hesitation, no waiting. Shaq turned back to the receptionist, tilting his head slightly. The young man's face burned red, his gaze locked on the computer screen in front of him, pretending not to notice the glaring contradiction. Shaq let the silence stretch again. The receptionist finally looked up, and for the first time, there was no forced smile, just discomfort. Shaq wasn't the type to make a scene. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make people second-guess themselves. But right now, standing in this shop, being blatantly dismissed while another man walked in and got a seat without question, it wasn't about a haircut anymore. He could feel the eyes of the other barbers, the clients in the chairs, even the young barber in the back who had been pretending not to notice. The receptionist swallowed again. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his massive hands resting on the counter. "Fully booked, huh?" The young man nodded stiffly. Shaq stared at him for a long moment before finally pushing away from the counter. "All right," he said simply. No anger in his voice, just an understanding, one that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. He turned to leave, moving slowly, giving everyone in that shop a moment to sit with what had just happened. But just as he reached the door, something unexpected happened. A voice, not from the receptionist, not from the manager, from the young barber in the back. "I can take him." The words were barely above a mumble, uncertain and hesitant, but in the heavy silence of the room, they might as well have been a shout. Every head turned. Shaq stopped in his tracks. The young barber, a kid, really, no older than 24 or 25, was standing beside his station, fidgeting slightly but holding his ground. He wasn't looking at Shaq. He was looking at his coworkers. The manager, a heavy-set man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward, his face darkening. "We're booked, Devon," he said sharply. Devon, the young barber, shifted on his feet but didn't back down. "I don't have an appointment until 2. The manager's jaw tensed. The other barbers avoided looking at him. Shaq watched the exchange closely. Devon exhaled and turned to Shaq. "I can take you," he said again, this time with more confidence. Shaq studied him. The kid looked nervous but determined, like he knew he was crossing a line but had decided it was worth it. Shaq glanced at the manager. The older man's expression was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. "No," the manager said, his voice colder now. "We are booked." Devon's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't sit down. Shaq gave him a nod, appreciating the effort, but he had already made his decision. "Nah, it's cool, man," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know when I'm not wanted." Devon looked like he wanted to argue, but Shaq had already turned away, pushing open the door and stepping back out into the sunlight. The city was still moving. The world hadn't stopped just because a moment of quiet injustice had played out behind glass doors. Shaq ran a hand over his head, feeling the stubble beneath his fingertips. He still needed a haircut. But now it wasn't just about that. He took a deep breath and started walking, because something told him this story wasn't over yet. Not even close. Shaq stood just outside the barbershop, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement, but the warmth on his skin did little to ease the cool tightness in his chest. It wasn't about the haircut. It never was. He exhaled slowly, staring through the shop's glass windows. Inside, the barbers had gone back to their work, or at least they were pretending to. The receptionist was typing something on his computer, avoiding even the possibility of looking outside. The young barber, Devon, was still at his station, hands clenched into fists, staring at the floor like he was fighting an invisible battle inside his head. Shaq's jaw tightened. He had been here before. Different places, different faces, but the same unspoken thing hanging in the air. At first, he had thought maybe it was his size. 7 feet tall, built like a freight train. Maybe they were intimidated. Maybe they thought he was too big for their delicate, refined space. But that excuse didn't hold up, not when he had walked into exclusive places before and seen them accommodate all types of people. No, this was something deeper. He took a slow step forward, then another. A part of him told him to let it go, to walk away, to not give them the satisfaction of knowing they had gotten under his skin. But another part of him, one that had spent years breaking barriers, pushing against walls meant to keep people like him out, told him otherwise. He reached for the handle and pulled the door open again. The same silence fell over the shop, sharper this time. Shaq walked in, his steps slow and deliberate, the weight of his presence undeniable. The receptionist's fingers paused over the keyboard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. Shaq didn't look at him right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the barbers, scanning each face, reading their expressions. Some pretended to be deeply invested in their work. Others cast quick, uncomfortable glances toward the manager. Finally, he spoke. "Fully booked, huh?" His voice was calm, steady, not confrontational, not aggressive, but carrying an undeniable weight. The receptionist forced another tight-lipped smile, but this time his confidence had cracked. Yes. Like I said, sir, we're booked all day." Shaq crossed his arms, letting the silence stretch between them. "Right." He nodded slowly. "So that guy that just walked in, what, he had an appointment?" The receptionist's face went pale. Well, Mr. Calloway is a regular client." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "That right?" The receptionist fumbled for words, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter like he was bracing himself. Behind him, one of the older barbers, graying at the temples, his arms tattooed with intricate designs, muttered something under his breath. It wasn't meant to be heard, but the shop was too quiet, and Shaq's hearing was too sharp. Should have known he wouldn't just leave. Shaq's head turned slightly, his eyes locking onto the barber. "What was that?" he asked, his voice still calm but now carrying a slight edge. The barber's hands stilled mid-trim. His jaw tightened. He didn't repeat himself. Shaq exhaled through his nose. There it was. The thing no one wanted to say out loud. The reason the air in this place had felt different the second he walked in. This wasn't about being booked. It wasn't about size. It was about the unspoken rules of places like this. Places that catered to a certain type of clientele, where a man like Shaq, despite all his wealth, fame, and status, still didn't fit. And the part that burned the most? They weren't even bold enough to say it. Shaq let his eyes linger on the barber for a moment longer before shifting his focus back to the receptionist. "What's your name, man?" he asked, his tone even. The receptionist blinked. It's Adam." Shaq nodded slowly. "All right, Adam." He leaned in just slightly, not enough to intimidate, just enough to make sure there was no escaping the moment. "You're looking me in the eye and telling me this place is booked solid, all day long, no room at all?" Adam's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked like he wanted to shrink into the floor. One of the other barbers coughed. Another pretended to adjust his tools. Shaq could feel Devon watching from the back, shifting uncomfortably. Finally, Adam swallowed. It's policy, sir." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Policy?" Adam nodded quickly, seizing onto the word like it was a life raft. "Yes, sir. Shop policy. We only take clients with prior appointments." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Funny how that policy didn't apply 10 minutes ago. Adam had no answer for that. The weight of the silence was suffocating now. Even the customers could feel it, shifting in their chairs, eyes darting between Shaq and the staff. Shaq inhaled deeply, then exhaled, letting the tension settle in the room. He had seen enough. "All right," he finally said, his voice carrying a quiet finality. "I get it." He turned to leave, his movements slow and measured. But before he could take another step, Devon, the young barber in the back, spoke up again. "It's not right." The words were so soft at first, Shaq almost thought he imagined them. He turned back. Devon was standing a little straighter now, his hands at his sides, his expression torn between frustration and hesitation. The other barbers tensed. The manager, standing near the entrance to the back room, shot him a warning look. Devon hesitated but didn't back down. I mean, we do have space. I got an open chair. The silence in the shop deepened. Adam looked like he wanted to disappear. The other barbers were now visibly uncomfortable, their eyes bouncing between Devon and the manager. The manager stepped forward, his voice sharp. Devon, step in the back. Devon clenched his jaw but didn't move. I can take him. The manager's nostrils flared. Now. Shaq watched the exchange, his gaze shifting between Devon and the manager. For a moment, he thought the kid might push back harder. He had the look of someone who knew what was happening was wrong, but also the look of someone who understood his place here. And that was the part that hurt the most. Devon exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the back room, disappearing through the door. Shaq clenched his jaw, then turned back to the rest of the shop. No one said anything. No one met his gaze. Shaq nodded once. All right, he said again. This time, there was no humor in his voice. Then, he turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind him, cutting off the heavy silence inside. The city moved around him like nothing had happened. But Shaq knew better. Something had just happened. Shaq stood outside the barbershop, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He could feel the tension in his chest, that familiar knot of frustration. But something inside him knew this wasn't the time for an outburst. He didn't need to make a scene, not in the way people expected from someone like him. Instead, he pulled out his phone. He wasn't angry, not yet. There was a cold, controlled fury behind his calm exterior, something quieter, but much more powerful. He had been here before, fighting battles with his presence, with his words. But now he had a platform that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Shaq swiped open his Instagram livestream, his thumb moving quickly across the screen. A few seconds passed before the familiar red circle appeared, signaling that he was live. Yo, what's up, family? Shaq's voice was warm and welcoming, like he was speaking directly to his friends, which, in a way, he was. I'm here at this fancy barbershop in the city, trying to get a cut, just like anyone else. He panned the camera to the shop's glossy windows. But check this out. This place apparently doesn't want me in here. He stepped back, pointing the camera at himself now, a small but knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. His followers had already started to flood in, a steady stream of comments popping up across the screen. Shaq, what happened? They really did you like that? This isn't okay. Shaq kept his voice even, letting his words sink in. See, they told me they were fully booked. But here's the thing. They let a guy who walked in right after me get seated immediately. And they were fully booked. He laughed, a dry, almost incredulous sound. You tell me if that doesn't smell a little off. The comments section exploded. Fans, supporters, even celebrities weighed in with their reactions. Shaq, tell us what's going on. This is messed up. I know you don't need this, but it's about respect. Shaq paused, letting the comments roll in as he scanned the shop's entrance. The thing is, I don't need a haircut. I could go anywhere, any barbershop. But the principle? The principle is what's important. He made sure the camera angle showed the barbershop's interior, the employees, the empty chairs, and the uncomfortable, anxious glances exchanged behind the counter. He made sure to catch every little shift in body language. In the back of the shop, he noticed one of the barbers, the younger one, the one who had wanted to help him earlier, glancing nervously at the phone in Shaq's hand. His eyes darted between the phone and his co-workers, unsure of how to react. Shaq's audience was relentless. The live stream had over 50,000 viewers now, and the number was climbing fast. Messages flooded in, many expressing outrage, some showing support for Shaq's calm approach, and a few questioning the motives behind the barbershop's actions. Shaq, you're the GOAT, don't let them get away with this. I'm calling this barbershop right now. Man, if you need a fresh cut, you can come to my place anytime. One comment stood out among the others. This is about more than a haircut. They tried to put you in your place. Shaq didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back into the shop, his expression serious now. He kept the camera rolling, capturing the palpable tension inside. He saw the manager now, pacing in the back, his face tight with frustration. The older barbers were watching Shaq's feet on their phones, trying to pretend they weren't, but there was no denying the unease creeping into their postures. One of the younger barbers, a tall man with a short beard, walked past the counter, his movements quick and stiff. Shaq could see the guilt written all over his face. He didn't look like he was just trying to avoid being on camera. He looked like he had been caught. Shaq's gaze followed him for a moment before returning to the camera. It's not just about me, y'all. It's about what happens when people like me walk into spaces like this and they get treated like we don't belong. And I'm not talking about size. I'm talking about something deeper. It's the look. It's the feeling. And I'm tired of it. A moment of silence fell over the live stream. For a brief second, the flood of comments slowed, and in that stillness, Shaq let his words hang in the air. He wasn't asking for sympathy, but for people to understand the reality of what was happening. He could feel the barbershop staff shifting now, moving with unease, unsure of how to respond. The manager had stopped pacing, now watching him with narrowed eyes, his arms crossed in front of his chest. The other barbers weren't working as much as they were fidgeting, avoiding eye contact. Shaq's phone buzzed with a message from one of his closest friends. He glanced at the screen, reading the simple text. "You got this, man. Just keep it cool." He smiled slightly. That was the message he needed. "See, here's the thing," Shaq continued, looking directly into the camera. "I've been around for a while. I know how to handle situations like this. I don't need to raise my voice. I don't need to throw a fit. I'm Shaq. I'm already bigger than this. But I'm doing this because there are kids out there who don't have the platform I do, and they have to deal with this kind of treatment every day. That's what this is about." The live stream comments had exploded again. But now, they weren't just people reacting. They were calling for action. "Boycott this shop. Get them, Shaq. They need to apologize publicly." Shaq looked over at the manager one last time. "You know, this could have been handled differently. It could have been simple. But you chose this route." The manager's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. He took a step toward Shaq, though he didn't get too close, stopping just behind the counter. "You're making a scene, Shaquille," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't need this kind of attention." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his expression unfazed. "I'm not making a scene. I'm just showing the world what's really happening here." He turned the camera on the barbers again, capturing the silent, uncomfortable atmosphere. "This isn't about me. It's about what happens when you ignore the truth for too long." The manager opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself, clearly realizing that nothing he could say would diffuse the growing tension in the room. In the back, Devon, the young barber who had tried to stand up earlier, was visibly shifting, looking uncomfortable, guilt pulling at his features. He glanced at Shaq's phone again, his eyes flicking nervously from the camera to his coworkers. Devon took a deep breath, then, unexpectedly, stepped toward the counter. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter than before but firm. "This is wrong." Shaq nodded at him. "It's all right, man. You tried." Devon looked at Shaq, then back at the other barbers. For a brief moment, the tension felt like it might break, but the manager's cold stare silenced any further words. Shaq ended the live stream, his heart still pounding, but now a little lighter. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't fought. He had done what was harder than any confrontation. He had exposed the truth. As Shaq turned and left the shop for the second time that day, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a haircut. It wasn't just about him. It was about something far bigger than any one person could change alone. But maybe, just maybe, he had started something here. Something told him this wasn't over. Shaq was just about to leave when he heard the voice. It was quiet at first, hesitant, almost unsure of itself. "I can take you." The words cut through the heavy silence in the shop like a blade. Shaq stopped mid-step, his hand still on the door handle. He turned slowly, scanning the room for the source. The barbers had been silent before, their eyes downcast, their hands moving mechanically. But now, one of them, one of the younger ones, stood slightly apart, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening around the towel draped over his shoulder. It was Devon. Shaq studied him, his deep eyes locking onto the kid's nervous but determined face. Devon couldn't have been more than 25, maybe 26. He had that fresh ambition in his eyes, the kind of hunger that hadn't yet been dimmed by years of compromise. But right now, he looked torn, like a man caught between two worlds, two choices. The rest of the barbers turned toward him in shock. The room was no longer just silent, it was charged. The receptionist, Adam, stiffened. The older barbers exchanged glances. One of them muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. And then, like a storm rolling in from the back of the shop, the manager appeared. He was a stout man, bald with a neatly trimmed beard, and the kind of presence that demanded control. His eyes landed on Devon first, then flicked toward Shaq. He didn't look surprised to see the NBA legend still standing there, just irritated that this situation hadn't gone away like he expected. "What's going on here?" The manager's voice was sharp, carrying authority. Devon's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides. "I said I can take him." The manager's expression darkened, his jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Devon," he said, his voice now dangerously calm, "we are booked." Shaq leaned against the counter, watching the scene unfold like an interested spectator. He wasn't going to step in, not yet. This wasn't his battle. This was about Devon now. The young barber hesitated for only a second before squaring his shoulders. "I don't have a client right now. I can take him." The manager stepped closer, lowering his voice so only those nearby could hear. "That's not how we do things here," he said. His tone was a warning, a silent threat wrapped in civility. Shaq had seen this play out before. He knew exactly what this moment was. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about appointments. It was about power. Devon was at a crossroads, and he knew it. He could sit back down, nod his head, and fall in line. He could pretend none of this ever happened, finish his shift, and go home with no consequences. Or he could stand his ground and face whatever came next. Shaq tilted his head, watching closely. Devon exhaled slowly, then turned fully toward his boss. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his voice steady, "I think how we do things here is the problem." The air in the room changed instantly. The manager's expression shifted from stern authority to something else, something more dangerous. His eyes narrowed. His lips pressed into a thin line. The other barbers were frozen in place, their eyes darting between Devon and the manager like spectators at a fight they wanted no part of. The receptionist looked deeply uncomfortable now, glancing at the phone on the counter like he was debating whether to call someone. Shaq didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. This wasn't his moment to steal. The manager stepped closer to Devon, his voice dropping even lower. "You sure you want to do this?" It wasn't a question. It was a final warning. Devon swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I do." The tension in the room was suffocating now. No one spoke, no one moved. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the manager took a slow step back. He studied Devon, as if memorizing his face. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "All right," the manager said, his voice smooth now, almost amused. "Go ahead." Devon hesitated, as if waiting for some kind of catch, but the manager simply gestured toward Shaq with a small flick of his hand. "If you want to cut his hair so badly, be my guest." It was too easy, too smooth. Shaq knew exactly what the manager was doing. He wasn't backing down. He was setting Devon up. If Devon went through with this, he wouldn't have a job by the end of the night. Shaq studied Devon, wondering if the kid understood what he had just done. But Devon didn't hesitate anymore. He turned toward Shaq, grabbed his tools, and gestured toward an open chair. "Right this way, sir." Shaq didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, walking past the other barbers, past the receptionist, past the manager. And as he sat down in the chair, he noticed something. The other barbers, the ones who had stayed silent, who had looked away, who had refused to acknowledge what was happening, were watching Devon now. And some of them looked inspired, like they were realizing for the first time that they had a choice too. Devon fastened the cape around Shaq's shoulders, his hands steady now, his nerves pushed aside by focus. Shaq caught his reflection in the mirror. He saw himself, saw Devon, saw the barbershop behind them. And he knew, right then and there, this was bigger than a haircut. This was a turning point. For Devon, for the shop, for everyone watching. The manager turned on his heel and disappeared into the back room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. And Shaq? Shaq just smiled. Shaq sat in the barber's chair, his massive frame nearly swallowing it whole. Devon, the young barber who had just risked everything, draped the cape over him and grabbed his clippers. His hands were steady now, his nerves gone, replaced with quiet determination. But the shop? The shop was anything but calm. The manager had vanished into the back room, no doubt scrambling to figure out how to handle the mess he hadn't seen coming. The other barbers kept their heads down, their hands moving in slow, hesitant strokes, as if trying to act like business was continuing as usual. But it wasn't, not even close, because something was happening outside. Shaq noticed it first in the mirror, the reflection of movement beyond the large glass windows. People walking by, pausing, looking inside. Some pulling out their phones, others whispering to each other. Then, a knock. Not from inside the shop, but from the outside window. Shaq turned his head slightly, catching sight of a young man holding up his phone, clearly recording. He was talking into the camera, gesturing toward the shop with wide eyes. More people gathered behind him. Some were typing on their phones, others were watching with folded arms. The crowd wasn't huge, yet, but it was growing. Devon hesitated mid-trim, glancing at Shaq. You seen this? Shaq chuckled, nodding toward the window. Looks like the world's paying attention. Devon swallowed, refocusing on the cut. But Shaq could tell. The kid knew exactly what was happening. Shaq's live stream had already exposed the situation, but now, people were showing up. The door swung open abruptly. Adam, the receptionist, rushed out from behind the counter, glancing between Shaq, Devon, and the crowd outside. His face was pale, his breathing uneven. "We have a problem," he muttered under his breath. Shaq leaned back slightly in the chair, raising an eyebrow. "We do?" Adam rubbed the back of his neck, lowering his voice. "Look, some reporters are outside, and people are calling the shop. A lot of people." Shaq didn't have to check his phone to know exactly what was happening. His live stream had reached tens of thousands of people in minutes. And the thing about social media? It didn't stop. The moment people saw something unjust, they shared it. Then their friends shared it. Then the media caught wind. And now, the little barbershop that thought it could quietly brush him off was suddenly on the verge of becoming national news. Shaq tapped his fingers on the armrest, watching Adam squirm. "I don't know what to do," Adam admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "I got an idea." Adam's eyes lit up with hope. "Yeah?" Shaq grinned. "How about y'all just treat people right in the first place?" Adam winced, looking away. Before he could say anything, the backroom door swung open, and the manager stormed out. His face was flushed, his phone clenched in his hand. The moment he stepped forward, the energy in the room shifted. The barbers straightened, the receptionist froze. Even Devon's clippers stilled for a second. The manager wasn't just frustrated anymore, he was panicking. He walked straight to Shaq, his voice low and tense. "All right, you've made your point." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" The manager inhaled sharply. "You're putting on a show. You got your live stream, you got people outside. You happy now?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He studied the man, letting the silence sit there long enough for it to get uncomfortable. Then, finally he spoke. "Nah," he said simply. "Not yet." The manager's nostrils flared. "Look, we don't need this. We run a business, all right? And right now you're hurting it." Shaq chuckled. "Oh, I'm hurting it? Thought y'all were fully booked? Shouldn't be a problem, right?" The manager's jaw clenched. "You're twisting this." Shaq leaned forward slightly, his massive frame making the distance between them seem smaller than it was. "Nah, I'm just making sure people see what's been happening all along." The manager opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew he had lost. Shaq wasn't yelling. He wasn't cursing. He wasn't causing a scene. He was just existing, and that alone had been enough to expose the problem. The tension was thick, but before anyone could say anything else, the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't Adam. It was someone new. A woman, dressed in a sleek business suit, her phone in her hand, her eyes scanning the room like she had just walked into a crime scene. The moment the manager saw her, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders stiffened. His expression, once filled with barely concealed irritation, shifted to one of forced professionalism. Shaq noticed immediately. Whoever she was, she had power here. The woman's gaze landed on Shaq. "Mr. O'Neal." She nodded in acknowledgement, then turned toward the manager. "What exactly is going on here?" The manager hesitated. We... The woman held up a hand. "I don't need excuses. I need answers." Adam took a step back. The barbers, sensing the shift in control, did the same. Shaq sat there, letting it unfold. He could already tell, this woman wasn't here to protect the shop. She was here to protect the business. Shaq leaned back in the chair, watching the manager stumble over his words. This was a misunderstanding," the manager finally said. "We had a miscommunication at the front desk, and unfortunately, Mr. O'Neal was given incorrect information." The woman narrowed her eyes. "Incorrect information?" The manager nodded quickly. "Yes, we had a scheduling issue. That's all." Shaq smirked. "That what we're calling it now?" The woman turned back to Shaq, her expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, she nodded toward Devon. "And this barber? What's his involvement?" The manager hesitated. He took it upon himself to do the right thing," Shaq interrupted, his voice even. Devon stiffened, unsure of whether that was a good or bad thing. The woman studied the young barber for a moment, then turned back to the manager. "I'll be handling this from here." The manager's face paled. "But from here," she repeated, finality in her voice. The manager clenched his jaw, then nodded once, stepping back. Shaq watched him, saw the defeat in his eyes. He wasn't sure if the man had learned anything, but it didn't really matter, because the world had already seen. Shaq turned back toward Devon, gesturing for him to continue the cut. The young barber hesitated for only a second before nodding, turning the clippers back on. Outside, more people had gathered. Some were just curious. Others were holding up their phones, capturing history as it happened. And inside, a shop that had once been so sure of its rules, of its power, was now scrambling to survive. Shaq didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to throw a fit. All he had to do was be there, and let the truth do the rest. Because he knew, this story wasn't over yet. Outside, the crowd had grown. People leaned against the windows, phones held high, recording every moment. Some were talking into their screens, explaining the situation to their followers. Others simply watched, waiting for whatever was about to happen next. Inside, the air was crackling, uneasy, charged, on edge. The manager stood stiff near the counter, arms crossed, his face a shade of deep frustration. He wasn't looking at Shaq anymore. He was staring at Devon, and Devon knew it. The young barber's hands paused for a moment, his fingers tightening around the clippers. Then, with a controlled breath, he continued the cut, refusing to be shaken. But Shaq saw it, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The other barbers were whispering now, their hushed voices bouncing off the walls like static. Some were shaking their heads. Others were casting quick, unsure glances at the manager, waiting to see how he would react. Shaq, watching it all unfold in the mirror, knew exactly what was coming next. It wasn't about if, it was about when. And then it happened. Devon finished his last stroke, set the clippers down, and exhaled. Then he stepped back and said, "I'm done." The words echoed louder than they should have. Shaq turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "Appreciate you, young blood. You mean the cut or something else?" Devon pulled the barber cape from Shaq's shoulders and folded it carefully, as if giving himself one last moment to decide. Then he looked directly at the manager. "I quit." Silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt alive. the kind that made the walls feel tighter, the air heavier. The other barbers froze. The receptionist, Adam, paled. And the manager? He lost it. "You what?" His voice wasn't just angry, it was panicked. Devon stood tall, jaw tight. "I quit," he repeated, louder this time. The whispering stopped. No one had expected this, not even Shaq. The manager took a sharp step forward, his voice low but laced with desperation. "Devon, think about this. This is your career. You've got a stable spot here. You really want to throw that away over this?" He motioned vaguely toward Shaq, as if the entire situation could be reduced to something minor. Shaq let out a slow breath, keeping his face neutral. He wasn't going to step in. This wasn't his fight. This was about a man choosing his line in the sand. Devon's jaw clenched. "It's not over this. It's over everything." He glanced around the shop. "Every time we look the other way, every time we don't say something because we're scared of losing a paycheck. I'm tired of it." The older barbers shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, exhaled and ran a hand over his face. He didn't speak, but Shaq could tell. He was feeling it. The energy in the room had shifted. But the manager, he was unraveling. "You're making a mistake," he snapped. "You think you're some kind of hero? Let me tell you something, kid. Jobs don't just fall out of the sky. You quit here, and you'll be struggling to find another shop that'll take you." Devon didn't flinch. He simply reached down, unclipped his barber's apron, and folded it neatly. Then he set it on the counter. "I'll take my chances." Shaq grinned. That was the moment. The exact second where everything changed. The whispering got louder. Other barbers started exchanging looks, some uncertain, others inspired. Devon had been the first one to step up. But now there were cracks in the walls. The manager felt it, and for the first time, he looked scared. Shaq stood up slowly, stretching his shoulders. He turned toward Devon, nodding. "Proud of you, man." Devon exhaled. "Appreciate that." Then Shaq turned to the room, letting his gaze drift across every single barber. He wasn't going to raise his voice, he wasn't going to preach, but he was going to make sure they heard him. "Let me tell y'all something." His voice was calm, but it carried. "The way you run your shop, that's up to you. But the world's watching now, and if y'all keep doing things the way you've been doing them," he shrugged, "ain't gonna be much of a shop left." The manager stiffened. The barbers exchanged more glances. Some still looked uncomfortable, but others looked like something had woken up inside them. Shaq took one last look at the place, the shop that tried to shut him out, the shop that, in just 1 hour, had become a symbol of something much bigger. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. As he stepped outside, the crowd exploded. Cheers, whistles, claps, cameras flashing, people calling out his name. But Shaq just smiled. He knew what had just happened. The shift in the room? It wasn't just in the shop. It was everywhere. 3 days had passed since the barbershop incident, but the world hadn't moved on. If anything, the storm had only grown stronger. The video from Shaq's livestream had gone viral. News outlets had picked up the story. Social media was flooded with posts, reactions, and discussions. Some defended the barbershop, calling it a misunderstanding. But most people, they saw it for what it was. And the shop? It was struggling. Customers had canceled appointments. Negative reviews had flooded their page. The shop's once exclusive image had shattered, replaced with a label they desperately wanted to shake. And that's when they reached out. Shaq was in his hotel suite when his phone buzzed with an email. Subject: a conversation. "Mr. O'Neal, we'd like the opportunity to speak with you regarding what happened at our establishment. We believe there was a misunderstanding, and we'd like to set things right. If you're open to a conversation, please let us know." Vincent's grooming lounge Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He wasn't surprised. They had no choice now. He exhaled, rubbing his chin. Then, instead of replying, he did something else. He made a call. After quitting on the spot, he had walked straight out of Vincent's and into uncertainty. He didn't have a backup plan, no job lined up. He had taken a stand without knowing what came next. But then, Shaq's audience had done the rest. The comments had flooded in. Where does Devon work now? We're pulling up. Somebody give this man a chair at their shop. Best barber in the game. I got you, Devon. And just like that, opportunities started coming to him. A well-respected black-owned barbershop, King's Cuts, reached out the next morning. They had seen the video. They had seen him. And they had an open chair waiting. Now, just days later, Devon was at his new shop, and business was booming. Shaq walked into King's Cuts unannounced. The moment he stepped inside, the energy was different. It wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It wasn't exclusive. It was home. Laughter echoed over the buzzing clippers. The smell of aftershave and fresh-cut hair filled the air. Conversations bounced off the walls. Sports debates, jokes, stories. The heartbeat of a real barbershop. And at the back, Shaq spotted him. Devon was mid-cut, shaping up a customer's fade with precision. He hadn't seen Shaq yet, but the rest of the shop had. One of the older barbers, a man with salt and pepper hair and a deep voice, grinned. Well, damn. Big Shaq in the building. Heads turned, customers and barbers alike. And when Devon finally looked up, his eyes went wide. Yo, what? Shaq chuckled, stepping forward. You busy, young blood? Devon shook his head in disbelief. Nah, man, I mean, yeah, but... He turned to his client. You cool with me taking a little break? The man in the chair laughed. Bro, if Shaq is here for you, take all the time you need. Devon wiped his hands, still stunned. Man, what's up? What are you doing here? Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. Came to check on you, see how you doing. Devon exhaled, shaking his head with a smile. Man, it's been crazy. I wasn't sure what was going to happen after I walked out, but this shop? These guys? They took me in immediately. He gestured around the room, and the other barbers nodded, giving him props. Shaq looked around. I like this spot. Devon smirked. Yeah, man. We take walk-ins here. The whole shop erupted into laughter. Shaq grinned. That's what I like to hear. Then, he turned to Devon. Listen, I got something for you. Devon frowned slightly. What you mean? Shaq pulled out his phone and tapped a few buttons. Then, he held it up to the shop. Yo, Instagram family. Y'all remember Devon, right? The comments started flying in immediately. Devon in. My guy leveled up. Where is this shop? I need a cut. Shaq turned the camera back to himself. Y'all wanted to know where he's working now? This is it. King's Cuts. Best in the city. If you need a cut, this is where you go. The shop erupted. Devon's jaw dropped. Man, come on, you serious? Shaq winked. Watch what happens next. Meanwhile, Vincent's grooming lounge was drowning. The backlash hadn't stopped. The phone calls kept coming. The one-star reviews weren't slowing down. And now? Now their biggest regret wasn't turning Shaq away. It was losing Devon. They had expected him to struggle, to regret his decision. But instead, he was winning. And that forced them to ask a question they had avoided for years. Had they built something wrong? Had they made the kind of place where only a certain kind of person felt welcome? Had they pushed away the very community that had kept barbershops alive for generations? They didn't like the answer, but they couldn't ignore it anymore. Days later, Shaq finally responded to their email. His reply was short. I'll talk, but not at your shop. Meet me at King's Cuts. They agreed. And when the manager of Vincent's walked into King's Cuts that afternoon, the atmosphere was different. No cold silence, no tension. Just real energy, real people, real conversations. Shaq watched as the man took it all in. The laughing customers, the engaged barbers, the sense of belonging. Then, Shaq leaned forward and spoke. You see it now, don't you? The manager didn't answer right away. But eventually, he nodded. Because for the first time, he did. The ripple effect from Shaq's experience hadn't just faded into the news cycle. It had grown. What started as a moment of quiet exclusion had become a national conversation about respect, opportunity, and the power of standing up. Social media was still buzzing. People weren't just talking about the barbershop incident. They were demanding change. and Vincent's grooming lounge? They were feeling all of it. The backlash had hit hard. The bad press, the lost customers, the calls for boycotts. Their once premium reputation had turned into a stain. But the hardest part? It wasn't the lost business. It was realizing they had built something wrong, and they had two choices: ignore it or own it. And this time, they chose to own it. A week after the incident, Vincent's grooming lounge made a public statement. Not a corporate press release, not a carefully worded excuse. A real, raw apology. They posted a video featuring their barbers, including the manager himself. "We got it wrong," the manager admitted, his face visibly tense. "We let bias get in the way of how we run our shop, and that's not who we want to be. We disrespected a man who has spent his entire career lifting others up, and we failed to recognize our mistake in the moment." He took a slow breath. "We don't just want to say sorry, we want to make it right." Then came the real moment. "Starting now, we're offering free haircuts every month for underprivileged kids in our community. No requirements, no questions, just a seat in the chair." The message was clear. They weren't just apologizing. They were changing. Shaq saw the video. He watched the manager's face, heard the uncertainty in his voice, but also the effort. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And that mattered. Because this wasn't about punishing a shop. It wasn't about canceling people. It was about making sure the next kid who walked in there never had to feel the way Shaq did that day. And now, they wouldn't. But Shaq didn't stop there. He had been given a moment, and he knew how to turn moments into movements. He took to his platform, not to drag Vincent's further, but to push something bigger. Respect should be the standard, not a privilege. The post went viral. Celebrities, athletes, everyday people, it resonated with everyone. Because everyone had felt it before. The unspoken rules, the doors that close for no reason, the places that make you feel like you don't belong. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about one barbershop. It was about all of them. Meanwhile, Devon's life had changed forever. After his bold stand, his name had spread across the internet. He wasn't just a barber anymore. He was the barber. People were driving hours just to get a cut from him at King's Cuts. Celebrities reached out. Athletes started booking appointments. The shop was booming. And Devon was at the center of it all. He had risked his career. And now, he was on top. But it wasn't just about business. It was about what he proved. That doing what's right always pays off. A few weeks later, Shaq walked into King's Cuts again. No fanfare, no cameras, just him. The shop was packed, but the moment Devon saw him, his face split into a grin. "Yo, Shaq. Man, you need a cut, or you just checking up on me?" Shaq chuckled. "Little bit of both." Devon motioned toward his chair. "Say less. Let's get you right." As Devon started lining him up, Shaq looked around. The shop had energy, laughter, conversation, community. And then, his eyes landed on something near the entrance. A group of young kids, some barely 10 years old, sitting in the waiting chairs getting free cuts. And Shaq smiled. Because it wasn't just happening here. It was happening everywhere. More barbershops had picked up the idea. More communities had joined in. One moment, one refusal, one stand. And now, real change. Shaq exhaled, looking at Devon through the mirror. "This is bigger than us, man," he said. Devon nodded. "Yeah, it is." Because in the end, it wasn't just about Shaq. It wasn't just about Devon. It was about everybody. And the world was just a little bit better. Some moments expose the truth. What you do next defines you. This wasn't just about a haircut. It was about who gets a seat and who gets shut out. The conversation has started, but the real question is, how many more doors need to be opened? Keep watching, because stories like this, they're just the beginning.